Mr. Forgetful by Roger Hargreaves. Hello boys and girls, today we're going to read Mr. Forgetful by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Are you sitting comfy? Okay, let's get started. Mr. Forgetful by Roger Hargreaves. It was one of those beautiful summer evenings that everybody likes to see. In Forget-Me-Not Cottage, the owner was fast asleep, Mr. Forgetful. He was having a dream. There's his cottage, and there's Mr. Forgetful asleep. The sun streaming through the windows woke up Mr. Forgetful. Oh, he yawned and stretched his arms and tried to remember what he had been dreaming about. But of course he couldn't, because Mr. Forgetful can't remember anything. Anything at all. Ever. Mr. Forgetful got out of bed and went to wash his face. But he'd forgotten where the bathroom was in his house. And do you know what he did? He walked into the wardrobe. Silly me, he giggled to himself. There he is, walking into the wardrobe, thinking that it's the bathroom. Eventually, of course, Mr. Forgetful found his bathroom and washed his face. He even remembered to clean his teeth. He then went downstairs to make himself some breakfast. He toasted some bread, but of course he couldn't. He forgot about it, and it was burnt. He boiled himself an egg, but of course he forgot about it, and it was hard-boiled. Mr. Forgetful has burnt toast and hard-boiled eggs for breakfast every day. There's Mr. Forgetful with his burnt toast and his hard-boiled egg because he forgets about them. It was such a lovely day that Mr. Forgetful decided to walk down the village to buy a stamp for a letter he'd written 3 weeks ago but had forgotten to post. Off he set. And did he remember to shut the door of the Forget-Me-Not cottage behind him? Of course he didn't. There's Mr. Forgetful posting a letter. I nearly forgot Mr. Forgetful's name. There's an early Katie Forgetful. Good morning, Mr. Forgetful, said Mrs. Parcel in the village post office. What can I do for you this fine morning? I'd like I've forgotten, he said. A stamp? Suggested Mrs. Parcel, looking at the letter Mr. Forgetful was carrying. Yes, a stamp. That's what it was I was trying to remember not to forget, said Mr. Forgetful. Mrs. Parcel smiled. She was used to Mr. Forgetful. There's Mrs. Parcel and there's Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful had some more shopping to do. But could he remember what he was supposed to remember not to forget to shop for? Of course he couldn't. So he decided to go home. There's Mr. Forgetful, forgetting what he was going to the shops for. On his way, he met the village policeman going the other way. Morning, Mr. Forgetful, said the policeman. Will you give Farmer Fields a message from me on your way home, please? Farmer Fields has had a farm not very far from Forget-Me-Not Cottage. Tell him there's a sheep loose in the lane, said the policeman. There's the policeman passing on the message. There's a sheep loose in the lane. Poor Mr. Forgetful. He'd never had a message to remember in his life before. There's a sheep loose in the lane, he said to himself, trying to remember the message as he hurried along. There's a sheep loose in the lane. There's a sheep loose in the lane. There's Mr. Forgetful trying to remember. There's a sheep loose in the lane. There's a sheep loose in the lane. There's a sheep loose in the lane. Mr. Forgetful repeated the message over and over to himself. There's a sheep loose in the lane. There he is, hurrying along, trying to remember the message. Eventually, he arrived at the farm and found Farmer Fields. Mr. Fields, he said, There's a goose asleep in the rain. Farmer Fields couldn't believe his ears. There's Mr. Forgetful. Now we know that that's the wrong message, don't we? There's a goose asleep in the rain, repeated Farmer Fields slowly. But I don't have any geese. And anyway, it isn't raining. Are you sure that's what the message was? Poor Mr. Forgetful. He'd got it all wrong, and he couldn't remember how to get it all right. He simply couldn't remember it all. So off he went home. Poor Mr. Forgetful. Can you see his little miserable face there? Poor Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful walked away from Farmer Fields' farm feeling very sorry for himself. I wish I could remember things, he thought. He was so busy feeling sorry for himself that he didn't see that there was a sheep loose in the lane. He bumped into it and fell over. Bother, said Mr. Forgetful. Bah, said the sheep. How silly letting a sheep loose in the lane, thought Mr. Forgetful. There he is, falling over the sheep. There's the sheep. Mr. Fields, he called as he ran into the farmyards. Mr. Fields, there's a goose asleep in the rain. He'd forgotten again. Mr. Fields scratched his head. Come with me, come on, cried Mr. Forgetful, and pulled Farmer Fields back along the lane until they came to the sheep that was loose. There it is, cried Mr. Forgetful, pointing. A goose. And then he stopped. Oh dear, he said. That's not a goose, is it? That's a sheep. And he blushed. There's Mr. Forgetful blushing. I think, smiled Farmer Fields, that you're the goose. And then he chuckled, and Mr. Forgetful giggled, and Farmer Fields laughed. And even the sheep started to laugh. It was so funny. There's Farmer Fields laughing and Mr. Forgetful giggling. Later that day, Mr. Forgetful sat down in his favourite armchair in Forget-Me-Not Cottage to think about what a funny day it had been. But do you know something? He tried and tried, but as try as he would, he simply couldn't remember anything that had happened. Oh, Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful by Roger Hargreaves.